I think that's what I've reflected on over time as the source of where my misaligned sense of masculinity came from, because I was placed into an environment where it allowed me to almost petri dish myself to a point where I forget about the sort of grey area of life. So coming out the other side, I often think about that, and I often think about how could I've changed things, how could I've done things differently. Obviously, I wouldn't change a thing if I had the choice, because I'm sitting here as I am today. But it's the traits that come with it that have molded who I am, my work ethic, the way I form relationships, and the way that I reflect on things, that's made me really think about why, as men, we are so lonely. Because I know that the reason that you've tackled this question is specific to a certain scenario, isn't it? And there's a few scenarios recently where I've found myself asking similar questions. So, just for context, for those listening, do you want to talk us through the scenario that really set you on the journey of exploring this, and then I'll unpack a few of the ones I've been dealing with myself recently.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can talk to what you just mentioned there as well, and we might come on to that later. So this the kind of situation that got me into this quest to kind of understand men and their friendship problem was kind of a personal crisis. I was planning on proposing to my girlfriend Naomi, and I went as far as buying a ring, and took a couple of female pals along to do that. It's going to help me out. And then we went to the pub afterwards, had the ring in the little box in my pocket, and they said, "Right, so this is happening. Who are you going to have as your best man?" And my mind sort of went blank. I thought, oh, couldn't think of anyone in the moment. I just thought, oh, I've had a beer, maybe that's it. So I get home and I sort of get a pad out and a pen and like, well, who are the candidates for this job? And it takes me ages to come up with 10 names. And I look down the list, and about half of them I work with, and I think they'd find it a bit odd if I asked them. It's kind of a bit too much. And the rest of these guys, some of them I hadn't seen for 2, 3 years. And I just thought, oh, where have all my male friends gone? And when I looked into it, this is a really well established thing. We're not talking about it, or we haven't been talking about it, maybe a bit more recently, since the early 70s, when they started measuring social networks and things. Men have had less friends, especially less close friends, than women, and it gets worse as you get older. So, as a kind of a fun bit of context, if you look at people's social lives, and they've studied this with phone data and all sorts, we know that people's social world thrives and is at its most kind of plump and its biggest in your late teens, early 20s. Kind of makes sense. And as you get older, it shrinks for everyone, but it shrinks a lot worse for men than it does for women. So you'll find that men in their 20s have a bigger social group than women. We get into our 40s, it's flipped on its head. And this gets worse and worse as guys get older. So there is a friendship problem. So I just thought, well, why does that happen and how can we solve it?
And you wrestled with that crisis, didn't you? You really did. And actually, there's something I can't remember where I heard you say it, but it's something that forced me to think about how I approach discussions, which is you're still a bit reserved about hugging other men, aren't you? Even now, even as an expert. And I don't mean that as a criticism, as an arrow I've just fired at you, but it goes back to what you said earlier about that sort of inherent, there's always something hardwired in the back of your mind that you revert to.
Yeah.
And whether it is that sort of dynamic that I explained where show no weakness to your friends at 16, 17, 18 years old that might think, oh, he's embracing that hug a bit long. It's a bit odd. Whatever it is, we do have these things that are difficult to rewire, don't we?
Yeah, like old habits die hard. And also, I think this is kind of a big theme, I think, around men and friendships with one another is that the scripts of close relationships for men are almost all romantic. So when you do something that looks like intimacy, almost inevitably your mind goes, "Oh, is this?" It's not as direct as going, "Is this gay?" But there is kind of this internal reticence a little bit where you are more reluctant than, for example, no problem hugging female friends. And I think this is a big thing I've learned about masculinity is we code switch as guys all the time. So if you see a guy who's like hard, and then a kid comes along, they can suddenly switch into a version of themselves, and you're like, that's a different person. Or when they're with their female friends, they're like completely different, and that was certainly true of me. So I think masculinity, what is it? It's something I think that exists between us rather than in us. Like we get around men, and there's something in the charge, and we change our behaviours. We code switch into a version of ourselves. I noticed I was on a stag do at the weekend. I'm like I get to the airport, chest is out, I get louder, my banter gets a bit spicier. I was like, what's happened to me? I've just suddenly got around other men. Okay. So we recognize that in ourselves. And what I think something I've got better at is realizing when I'm getting into that mode and understanding that that's fine in some contexts, but in other contexts and for other outcomes, like building a close friendship, you're going to have different routes into connecting with people.